The lights in the London studio burned hot, but Piers Morgan was in his element. He leaned back in his chair, one brow arched, eyes gleaming with that familiar smirk, half amused, half daring. Across from him sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, posture straight, jaw set, his eyes unblinking. The segment was supposed to be about West African leadership and global alliances. But 5 minutes in, Piers was already steering it towards something else. Something personal. "So tell me," Piers said, flipping through his notes theatrically, "when you say self-determination, do you mean resisting development? Or just rejecting pronunciation?" The audience laughed lightly, nervously. Traoré didn't blink. Piers pushed further. "I mean, Captain, let's be real. You say you want a new world order, but you can barely deliver a sentence in English without tripping over half the words. Maybe start with language before leading revolutions?" He chuckled at his own line, clearly expecting a defensive response, or silence. He got neither. Traoré adjusted his mic slowly, then leaned forward, his voice calm. "My accent isn't a weakness. It's a reminder," he said. "That the language you use to dominate, we learned it only to dismantle it." The studio fell quiet. "I speak your language," Traoré continued, his tone even, "but I don't speak for you. And I don't need your approval to speak with power." Piers shifted, smile faltering for the first time. "You mock the way I speak. But I'll tell you what's broken, it's not my words. It's the idea that fluency equals superiority." A beat passed. The silence became uncomfortable. Then Traoré delivered the line that would go viral within the hour. "Maybe if your empire had listened this clearly, it wouldn't have fallen so loudly." The audience didn't laugh this time. They stared. Piers blinked. For the first time, he seemed unsure whether he was still hosting a show, or losing control of it. The silence stretched. Piers Morgan, seasoned in confrontation, was rarely caught off guard. But Traoré's words hadn't just pierced the studio, they'd fractured the balance of power in the room. Piers cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "Well, I suppose that's one way to twist a sentence." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He simply tilted his head, the kind of stillness that made people nervous. Then he said softly, "You call it twisting. I call it revealing." Piers shifted in his seat. "You've built a system," Traoré continued, "where if someone speaks English with an accent, they are seen as less intelligent, less capable, less human. And yet, some of the most violent decisions in history were made in perfect English." A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. The camera cut to a wide shot. Producers behind the glass froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment breathe. Piers tried again. "Surely, Captain, you must realize, presentation matters. Delivery matters. If you want the West to take you seriously, communication must meet a standard." Traoré's expression hardened. "No. What you mean is, you'll listen when we sound like you. But we've tried that. We've played polite. We've mimicked your tone. And still, you ignore us, until we make you uncomfortable." Now it was Piers who leaned back, arms crossed, suddenly cautious. The air had shifted. The audience wasn't laughing. They weren't smirking. They were watching, closely. Traoré looked directly into the camera now, bypassing Piers entirely. "There is a world rising," he said. "And it doesn't need your stage to speak. It doesn't need your approval to be heard. And it certainly doesn't need to apologize for how it sounds." It wasn't just a message. It was a declaration. Piers opened his mouth, but nothing came. Because when a man speaks from conviction, not comfort, grammar doesn't matter. Power does. And at that moment, everyone in that room knew, power had just changed chairs. Piers glanced toward the control room, waiting for some kind of cue, an escape hatch, a producer's voice in his ear telling him to cut to break. Nothing came. Just static. So he forced a smile and leaned forward again, trying to reclaim the tone. "All right, Captain," he said, carefully, "let's assume your point about perception holds. But isn't there a reason international diplomacy is conducted in polished English? Doesn't clarity demand cohesion?" Traoré raised an eyebrow. "Clarity demands honesty. And honesty rarely sounds rehearsed." The room tensed again. Piers looked like he'd just bitten into something sour. "Is that what this is then?" Piers asked, his voice rising. "A performance of authenticity? You come on my show, tear apart the language we use to connect the world, and expect applause?" Traoré's gaze didn't waver. "No. I expect to be heard. Not for applause. But for truth." Then, with calm precision, Traoré pulled a folded paper from his jacket. It was an excerpt from a colonial-era British textbook, one that described African leaders as tribal figures to be managed. He read it aloud. "You taught us your language," Traoré said, voice steady. "And now you're shocked when we use it to show you your own reflection." The studio fell into a silence so complete, you could hear the creak of Piers's chair as he shifted again. "You see," Traoré continued, "you're not uncomfortable because my English is poor. You're uncomfortable because it's clear. Clearer than you expected. Sharper than you can control." He leaned back at last, allowing the words to hang. "You don't fear my accent. You fear my meaning." Piers blinked. Once. Twice. He tried to summon a rebuttal. Something, anything. But every sentence he imagined fell short, limp and inadequate. Because this wasn't about diction anymore. It wasn't about syntax. It was about who owned the conversation. And right now, it wasn't Piers Morgan. The comments section was already exploding. Clips from the interview were being clipped, shared, dissected in real time across X, TikTok, and YouTube. But inside the studio, Piers Morgan hadn't caught up to the moment yet. He still thought he was hosting a conversation. Traoré had made it something else. "So let me ask you this," Piers said, trying a new tactic, calculated calm. "If you reject our framework, our norms, our values, why come to Western media at all? Why even sit in that chair?" Traoré folded his hands. "Because you broadcast lies globally. I bring truth to the same frequency." The reply landed like a punch in the gut. Not loud. But hard. Piers chuckled awkwardly, pretending not to flinch. "You know, for someone who claims not to care about perception, you're very good at performing defiance." That was a mistake. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change his posture. He just replied, cool and quiet. "I'm not performing. I'm remembering. I remember what your governments called us, uncivilized. What your papers wrote, savages. What your leaders demanded, silence. And what now?" Piers asked, suddenly defensive. Traoré stared straight through him. "Now we speak. And you call it defiance. But this isn't rebellion. It's return. A return to dignity. On our terms." Piers' fingers tapped on the table nervously. He knew the cameras were rolling. He knew every second was being clipped by people who didn't need his framing anymore. And Traoré, he knew it too. "You asked why I came," Traoré said, turning his head toward the audience. "It wasn't to convince you." He looked directly at the camera again. "It was to remind them, your viewers, that we are no longer waiting to be invited into the room. We're building rooms of our own." The audience was frozen. Not out of confusion, but recognition. Piers looked smaller now. Not because he was losing an argument. But because the room, the world, had suddenly grown too big for the old format. The table he once controlled now belonged to someone else. The control room was in chaos. One producer whispered frantically into a headset, another hovered over the mute button, unsure whether to intervene or let the wildfire burn. But Piers Morgan was now fully aware, this wasn't going to be his usual win. He leaned in one more time, voice clipped with frustration masked as civility. "Captain Traoré, if you think we've been so wrong for so long, why come to Britain at all? Why not stay in your so-called sovereign space?" Traoré turned slowly toward him. His voice lowered, but carried more weight than any shout. "Because you don't get to erase what you've broken by closing your eyes." He tapped the table gently. "You came to our lands. You took. You drew lines, installed leaders, taught lies in schools, and then demanded gratitude. Now, when we speak, you ask us why we didn't stay quiet." He leaned in now, just slightly. "You invited yourself into our world. I'm just returning the visit." There was a long pause. Then Piers scoffed. "So this is revenge? A PR campaign?" "No," Traoré answered. "It's reclamation." The air was thick, no laughter, no applause, just breathless attention. Piers' audience wasn't just hearing a critique of colonial legacy. They were watching a system bend, if only a little. "You mock my words," Traoré continued. "But I've seen what yours do. They launch drones. They justify sanctions. They sign off on coups with words like stability and security." A murmur spread through the studio. Piers leaned back. "You sound paranoid." "No," Traoré said again, firmer. "I sound free." And with that, the temperature of the room changed. Traoré wasn't defending his identity anymore. He was declaring it. Not with a plea, but with posture. With presence. With a truth Piers couldn't dodge. It wasn't about English anymore. It wasn't about politics. It was about whose voice mattered. And in that moment, Traoré's voice drowned out the room. Piers Morgan tried to summon his signature smirk, the one that said, "I've got you cornered." But this wasn't one of those interviews. And Traoré wasn't one of those guests. "You talk about freedom," Piers said, a bit sharper now. "Yet your critics say you restrict the press. That you limit dissent. That you've centralized power." Traoré nodded slowly, unbothered. "Let me ask you something," he said. "How many times has your press lied to protect power? How many invasions did your media cheer for? How many lives were erased with headlines like, 'Collateral Damage'?" Piers froze. For a moment, he wasn't sure who was interviewing who. Traoré continued, his tone composed. "I do not fear criticism. I fear foreign narratives posing as truth. I fear your cameras when they only roll for chaos, never for rebuilding. You talk about freedom, but you weaponize visibility." Then he leaned slightly forward, not with aggression, but with clarity. "In my country, our people don't beg for perfection. They demand protection. And I protect them. Not for applause. Not for approval. But because no one else will." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Piers pressed on, desperate to regain footing. "So you're the only one who can decide what freedom looks like?" "No," Traoré replied. "But I know what it doesn't look like: foreign soldiers, corrupt aid, and microphones used as mirrors for your own ego." Ouch. Piers tried to pivot, his voice tightening. "So you're not here for peace?" Traoré smiled, but it wasn't warm. "I'm here to remind you, peace isn't the absence of war, it's the absence of control disguised as kindness." And just like that, the last thread holding Piers' authority unraveled. For once, he wasn't in charge of the narrative. He was part of it. Not the author. The example. And Traoré? He didn't just survive the stage. He owned it. Backstage, a junior producer whispered to her colleague, "This is going to break the internet." But inside the studio, Piers Morgan still believed he had one card left. He narrowed his eyes and said, "You speak of dignity, but dignity begins with humility. And frankly, Captain, your tone lacks it." It was the last refuge of someone losing control. Accuse your opponent of arrogance when their truth cuts too deep. Traoré tilted his head, slowly, studying Piers like a man who'd seen this exact play before, too many times. "You want humility," he said. "But only from the people you've spent decades silencing." Piers shifted uncomfortably. Traoré's voice was lower now, but sharper than ever. "You confuse volume with vanity. But I am not loud because I want attention. I am loud because you never listened when we whispered." Then he turned to the camera again, direct, unfiltered, intimate. "To every child who was told their accent made them less. To every elder mocked for how they prayed. To every nation told they needed permission to rise, this is not arrogance. This is arrival." The words pierced deeper than any insult. Not just because they were true, but because they were long overdue. Piers tried to push back. Arrival? At what cost? Division? Isolation? Traoré didn't flinch. "No," he said. "At the cost of pretending your approval is the only currency that matters." Now the audience was still, not confused, but transformed. They had come expecting controversy. Instead, they witnessed clarity. Not through shouting, but through something far more dangerous to old systems, unwavering self-respect. Traoré wasn't reacting anymore. He was defining. "I didn't come here to speak perfectly," he said finally. "I came to make sure silence is never the default again." And in that moment, his accent wasn't just understood. It was unforgettable. The control room was dead silent now. The cameras were still rolling, but the smirks were gone, even behind the glass. What had started as a sparring match had turned into a shift. Not in tone, but in time. Piers crossed his arms. His voice returned, but weaker. "So this is it, then? You lecture the West and walk away feeling heroic?" Traoré blinked once. "No," he said. "Heroes wear capes. I carry scars." Piers paused, not knowing whether it was an insult or something deeper. Traoré clarified, his voice firmer now. "You see defiance in my tone. But what you hear is pain. The pain of being spoken over, rewritten, renamed. Every accent you mocked carried a history you refused to hear." He leaned back in his chair, finally relaxed. "But I no longer speak to be accepted. I speak so those behind me know they can, too." That's when something unexpected happened. A low murmur of applause, first from the back row, then across the studio. Not a standing ovation. Not a viral moment. Just a real one. Piers looked to the audience like they had betrayed him. He raised his voice again, grasping for narrative dominance. "Are you saying everything we've done, media, diplomacy, education, has all been hollow?" Traoré shook his head. "No. I'm saying it was never neutral." Boom. There it was. The foundation cracked. The assumption undone. You don't get to pretend your language is clean while it whitewashes wars. You don't get to praise free speech while choosing which voices matter. You don't get to define reason while mocking the rhythm of my voice. He paused, then delivered the final line like a verdict. "My English isn't broken. It's just not yours." A silence fell so heavy it felt like the room stopped breathing. And Piers, once the voice of sharp wit and iron control, had nothing left but a dry throat and a broken stare. Because the truth wasn't just heard. It echoed. The debate was supposed to be over. The segment producer flashed the countdown, 30 seconds to commercial. The studio lights held steady. But nobody moved. Piers Morgan sat frozen in his chair, his usual smug control replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. Traoré wasn't done. "You want a soundbite," he said. "You want to clip this, twist it, feed it into your cycle." He looked directly into the main camera. Not to the host. Not to the audience. But to the millions watching behind glass, behind phones, behind cynicism. "Clip this, then." He raised his chin. "We are not here to ask for better chains. We are here to melt them. We are not waiting to be allowed at your tables. We are building our own. And if the accent bothers you, turn up the volume, because we're not lowering it anymore." Even the boom mic operator stood still. Piers tried one last pivot, thin and desperate. "So it's war, then? A cultural rejection of the West?" Traoré didn't blink. "It's not war," he said. "It's awakening. And you," he added with quiet precision, "can't stop it. Not with your language. Not with your laughter. Not with your rules." The screen behind them still read "Live." And across the internet, screenshots were already being taken, quotes being ripped and reposted. Traoré knew the format had flipped. This wasn't his interview anymore. It was his statement. And when he finally stood, adjusting the single button on his collar, the message wasn't in English or French. It was in presence. Dignity. Authority. Piers remained seated, finally understanding what his viewers had already realized. This wasn't a guest out of his league. This was a man who never asked for their game in the first place. As the broadcast wrapped, Piers Morgan leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on Ibrahim Traoré, who was already halfway to the exit. But something hung in the air, unspoken, undeniable. It wasn't defeat. It was displacement. The power in the room had shifted. Not with shouting, not with applause, but with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove, yet proved everything. A reporter backstage rushed up to Traoré. "Captain. Final thoughts for the press?" Traoré paused. He didn't need the mic anymore. He turned slightly and said, calmly, "Let this be the last time someone mistakes eloquence for worth. Or a foreign accent for a lack of mind." Then he kept walking. Online, the fallout was immediate. Clips from the show lit up every corner of social media. Memes couldn't dilute the weight of his words. Even those who disagreed with his politics found themselves replaying his calm dismantling of Piers' bravado. Every attempt to mock him only magnified how untouched he remained. Evening panels scrambled to reframe it. Was Traoré too aggressive? Is he dangerous? Should we be worried? But none of those questions mattered anymore. Because something deeper had been revealed. The West's illusion of narrative control was cracked, and it wasn't a foreign army that did it. It was a man who came to the microphone with a different weapon. Truth. Not as performance. But as posture. And while Piers Morgan stayed behind, trapped in the aftershock of his own assumptions, Traoré stepped into the night not as a guest on Western television, but as a voice too grounded to be spun, too principled to be framed, and too loud to be ignored. He didn't win their game. He walked away with the scoreboard. They mocked his English. They underestimated his silence. They thought if they laughed loud enough, they could bury his voice under their applause. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to perform. He came to reveal. To hold up a mirror to the very systems that once refused him a seat, and now couldn't look away as he stood at the center. While Piers Morgan searched for soundbites, Traoré delivered something more dangerous. Truth without apology. Presence without permission. And power without a single raised voice. He didn't fight to be accepted. He stood so others knew they didn't have to beg. And when the lights dimmed, the headlines rolled, and the clips went viral, one thing became crystal clear. You can mock a man's accent. But you can't silence his echo.